Okay, that should be about right. Ah! Whoops. Nothing broke though. 3, 2. Hey everybody, this is Blake here, and welcome to my review of blah 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 blah. Fuck. You know what? Screw it. I'm not even going to edit that part out. Hey everybody, this is Blake here, and welcome to my review of Exodus: Gods and Kings. What you just saw was me accidentally bumping into my desk because I removed the bottom drawer and the thing that slides out that usually carries the keyboard, so I could fit my chair under there and I won't be hunched over so much. But whenever I film, I usually put one leg over the other to keep it from falling asleep, and I keep forgetting that I cannot do that while my chair is under. In fact, that was a bit too close. Now you might be wondering why I'm even talking about this. I could say more about the situation with my desk than I could say about Exodus: Gods and Kings. So going into this movie, I was not very interested. Nothing about it looked bad. The trailers seemed fine. I like the cast. I like the director. I figured that this was going to be a solid flick. It's just, there's not a whole lot you could do with the story of Moses that you haven't already done before. And how can a movie compare to something like Ten Commandments, which is awesome? So I figured I'd see it, but only if there was no real competition. But if I had missed it during its theatrical run, I wouldn't lose any sleep. I'd be perfectly happy watching it for the first time on the small screen. But I did see it, and what do I feel? It's okay. This is one of those pain-in-the-ass movies where I have so little to say about it that I'm probably going to be constantly stumbling over my words or pausing awkwardly. And of course, my notes, I have I have about 6 or 7 things written down. Only one is positive, but that positive apparently is enough to propel Exodus into okay territory. And by okay, I mean it is technically well made. Special effects are pretty much flawless. I always found the CGI backdrops to be very convincing. The sets are very exotic, even though they're nothing that we haven't already seen before. Ridley Scott's direction is competent at worst, exceptional at best. There are some very intense and exciting sequences when something is actually happening. Other times it just seems like he focuses on the actors, which I don't blame him for, because this is a very good cast and there are some very strong performances. But during these moments the direction doesn't really stand out, which isn't, I guess, a criticism, because a lot of people feel that good directing doesn't stand out, that you don't really think about it because you're so emotionally invested in what's going on that you don't break the film down into its separate parts. And I'd usually agree, and if I liked this film more, I may have even praised it for this. The problem is that, while well made on every level, I was just so emotionally divorced from what was going on. I could care less. So there are quite a few things I need to talk about. Well, let me get this part out of the way. The acting is good all around. It has a strong cast, but the only performances which stood out to me were, well, the 2 main characters. Christian Bale as Moses. I was really concerned based on the trailers that this would be boring Christian Bale who's just mumbling through his lines and looking incredibly serious all the time. Pretty much the Christian Bale from Terminator Salvation. But no, he does showcase, some personality. When we meet him early on, he's actually kind of a fun guy to hang around. He's moral enough to where he's likable, but he can be kind of an ass, and he just seems, pretty funny, pretty charming, pretty charismatic. Now, as the film progresses, yeah, he becomes more and more serious and introspective, but I thought it fit with his development. You could see how much all of this is weighing down on him, and how he's becoming very stressed, and he seems to be losing weight throughout the course of the film. So I thought Christian Bale did a really good job. And then I really liked Joel Edgerton as the Pharaoh Ramses. At times, it did seem like he was fighting the makeup, which threatens to upstage him here and there. But still, he does quite a bit with a very, I don't want to say a thinly written role, but he doesn't have a lot of screen time, and yet still he comes across as the most developed and fleshed out character throughout the course of the film. Very expressive. You're not really sure whether you should feel bad for him or whether you should hate him, because there is a side to Ramses that you sympathize with, but at the same time he is kind of a monster. Yeah, that was an edit. Sorry, I got interrupted, and I was thirsty, and for some reason felt compelled to show you how I drink water from a bottle. This review is going to be a lot like Exodus in that it is very poorly paced and padded out. I assure you that at some point, me drinking from that water bottle was imperative to the story and the flow of this video. But unfortunately, the key scenes that would tie that in to the rest of this review were removed, explaining I have no idea what I'm talking about. I have my Twitter page up right now, so I'm just going to type, "I'm vlogging during this tweet," and go. So there is a strange shout out to all my Twitter followers, which is why you should follow me on Twitter. What was I talking about again? Oh yeah, Exodus. So it is a very poorly paced movie. It's a 2.5-hour long film that feels very much like a 4-hour epic. I was often bored and fighting sleep during my viewing experience. In the case of my father, who saw it with me, he did fall asleep. So what happened? Well, I had actually heard that this film was supposed to be a lot longer, maybe 3.5 to 4 hours long. And obviously that is going to screw up the pacing, because it always screws up the pacing. Okay, so there's two sides to look at this. Or two ways to look at this. You could either blame the studios for, chopping up a director's artistic vision. Valid argument, because that is always going to screw up the movie in the long run, even if it does, present it or, trim it down to a more manageable running time. A good example of this is The Deer Hunter. The Deer Hunter was like a 3.5 hour long movie. Everybody who saw it pretty much liked it. But then the studios got greedy and decided to cut it down to a certain point. I think it was more like 2.5 hours. Figuring if it's shorter, then people are going to like it even more, and it's going to make more money. Well, the people who saw it and saw the 2.5 hour long version felt that it actually had even more pacing problems, because by removing certain scenes, it disrupted the flow of the narrative. Suddenly, certain events seemed to matter even less, and the emotional connection was lost. So maybe the 4-hour cut of Exodus was much better, because I was much more invested in these characters and their situations, that it didn't feel quite so long, but I'm only speculating. However, I also believe the director should be blamed for this as well, because they should know by now that there's no way the studio is going to give a full theatrical push to a 4-hour long movie, especially one with this kind of budget. When was the last time you saw a 4-hour film get the full theatrical push? And if there was one that was released and had, a big marketing campaign and had a 4-hour long running time, was it financially successful? Because probably not. And Ridley Scott should understand this by now, because that's what happened to his Kingdom of Heaven. It was a much longer film that was cut down, and nobody liked the cut version. But at the same time, can you really blame the studio for wanting to do that? Because few people are going to want to go in the theaters in the first place to see a 3.5 hour long movie. So he should understand that better than most filmmakers, and he should have planned Exodus accordingly. He should have, developed this project as a 3 hour long feature. But he didn't, and the film suffered for it. So both the studios and Ridley Scott deserve blame for that. One of the problems with, cutting this movie down is that they usually remove scenes of character development or just fleshing out those characters in general. The relationships presumably mattered in the original cut, but don't matter anymore because there is no time dedicated to them, and yet they're still there, so they're taking up screen time. So, the relationship between, Moses and the Pharaoh, underdeveloped, doesn't matter. The relationship between Moses and his father or his mother figure or, his real brother, they're just so half-baked that you wonder why even set up, that dynamic in the first place if you're not going to do anything with it. The whole bit with Moses and his family is arguably even worse because it's there long enough to eat up screen time, but at the same time you just don't care because there's no stakes there. Okay, Moses might never see his wife and son again. That is very sad. But other than one scene where he rants about that, there's really no payoff. Instead, you just spend 20-25 minutes where he's, having these sweet and romantic scenes with his wife and kid. Boring. And certain characters you think were supposed to be important at certain points, like Ben Kingsley's character, he's around to explain Moses' origins, and then suddenly he becomes a background prop. And, Aaron and Joshua, they're set up to be important characters, but outside of their introductory scenes, they're just kind of there throughout the rest of the film. The worst example is probably Sigourney Weaver, whom I believe was supposed to be the Pharaoh's mother. She's jealous of Moses. She doesn't like him. She believes he's a threat to, Ramses' reign. So she wants Ramses to have him killed, but he doesn't want to. So Moses gets exiled instead, and she ends up sending assassins after Moses for just one scene, and that doesn't go well for them. But otherwise, after that big setup where you're wondering, is she going to play a major role throughout the course of the film? Is she going to be the one pulling Ramses' string? Once again presenting Ramses as a very tragic character. But no, she vanishes after the time skip. There's no line of dialogue that even says what happens to her. She just never appears again. And it's not like she was a major presence during the first act. She just occasionally showed up and was the villainous character. So why was she in this film at all? Well, once again, I presume during the much longer cut she was a more prominent character, but because so much of that was removed, she no longer feels like she is important anymore, and they may as well just have cut her out completely. Then the film would have been closer to a 2-hour running time, in which I'm sure it wouldn't have felt as slow, even though it probably still would have been a pretty shallow experience. So yeah, there's so much in terms of the narrative too I did not understand. So God goes to Moses and tells him, go free my people. He goes and he starts training them and getting them ready for a revolution, and he starts utilizing guerrilla warfare tactics. Well, eventually God just comes up to him and says, this is taking too long. You need to hurry it up. And Moses this is the best I could do. So then God takes over and starts performing the plagues. Now in the actual book of Exodus, Moses still plays a key role. He is pretty much the voice of God, warning them, and the plagues seemed based around him, or at least based on his warning of the plagues, which you don't get in this movie. It's just the plagues happen, in succession, and the only thing he really does is disapprove of the death of the firstborn, and he expresses concern that God interfering is in a way making it worse. So Moses feels kind of irrelevant at this point because the guerrilla warfare never amounted to anything, and he's just pretty much there as a spectator throughout the majority of the second act. Once God gets involved. So was that a problem with the original cut? I don't know, but it is still a problem in my opinion when your main character feels kind of superfluous. One thing that disappointed me was there are some very bold ideas that the director presents in this film, but at the same time, they aren't fully explored. For example, it's kind of ambiguous at first as to whether Moses is really communicating with God. He hits his head, on a rock, and that's when he starts having visions of, God and, God telling him to free his people. And when the plagues start happening, they do try to present, a natural explanation for them, which a lot of Christians apparently really did not like, which I think is kind of stupid. I believe that when God performs miracles, or, in terms of the context, I am a Christian, so to a point I do believe in this stuff. I do believe that he is using science. I believe that, if he did part the sea, it wasn't just, God using magic. I believe that there is a scientific reason or explanation for him to do that. But still the film utilizes that in a way to make you wonder once again, is God really behind all of this? Or, are the plagues purely coincidence and, Moses is just kind of hallucinating and, justifying these plagues as being part of, what God is doing, even though there could be a very natural and scientific explanation for them. Although that's still, it's an interesting idea, but the film doesn't really see it through. By the remaining plagues, you do believe that, yeah, God is definitely behind them because, how else can you explain the death of the firstborn son plague? Sorry, I'm going to lose my voice, and it's getting difficult speaking. So it's like, why even introduce that idea at all unless you're going to make a major point at it? With it, stay with this idea through the very end, and let the audience decide as to whether God exists within this movie or not. Another wasted idea, and actually this one I think stung even more, is the possibility that God is in fact a tyrant. He is represented in this film as a spoiled, violent-tempered brat of a child who is pretty much throwing a temper tantrum, and he is not a sympathetic character at all. And yet, by the end of the movie, there's just enough moments that left me confused as to what the agenda was. Like Christian Bale said in an interview that, he thought Moses was a schizophrenic who was very barbaric. Well, this movie does not present him as such. Now, the schizophrenic part, maybe, but, he is against God's, more morally ambiguous actions. He's thoroughly opposed to the death of the firstborn plague, and he feels that God in a way is causing more harm than he is helping, and he's upset that God has wasted all this time, allowed his people to suffer for 400 years and is only taking an interest now, when it's going to be much harder for the Egyptians to let them go because they become accustomed to having these slaves for so long. So it's like, but at the end, they're still sharing this smile, and God's kind of admiring Moses for questioning his actions, and it just left me confused as to what I was supposed to think. I like the possibility of, the viewer taking home what they want to hold on to. So if you want to believe that God does have a greater plan and there was a purpose for, his questionable actions, then you could accept that. While if you're under the belief that, yeah, God is kind of a dick in this movie, and you shouldn't be worshipped and or trusted, then you could, accept that angle as well. I would have really respected that, but unfortunately, just like I said, the way they go down, it just left me feeling more confused than anything. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to feel, and I'm not sure if the movie was sure we were supposed to feel. So that was disappointing. I kind of wonder if the studios told Ridley Scott to tone that down because, Christians particularly are probably going to be the one who make up the majority of the box office revenue, and they didn't want to miss out on that money. Or maybe Ridley Scott just kind of panicked and, he did not want to take such a big risk. So I don't know, but I still felt that that was an underexplored idea that I would have liked to have seen more of. This is in total contrast with Noah, which Noah in a lot of ways was the worst film. It had a lot of more pronounced flaws, but at the same time, it did go all out with its more controversial ideas, and I really respect Noah for doing that. It definitely explored some new territory, which I wanted to see Exodus do, but it unfortunately didn't. It played it safe, even though at times it seemed like it was going to have some balls. But oh well. Anything else I could say? This video has been kind of long, much like the movie. The whitewashing is pretty awkward, primarily because the good guys are portrayed by white people who look like white people, whereas the bad guys are either dark-skinned or they're white people whose makeup makes them look more dark-skinned. So, whoops, a little bit racist there. That's really all I got, though. It's not a bad movie. It's just its soul was taken out during the editing process, and well, at least that's what I'm presuming. And it's kind of misguided and a bit too cautious when it should be, bold and daring. But it wasn't, and if you want to see it, be my guest. I'd probably wait till it comes out on DVD. But it's up to you. So I did not do a written review of this, though. I have done written reviews of Spookies, Terror Train, both 80s horror films, Young Detective D, martial arts fantasy mystery, and my next one will either be Samaritan Zatoichi or Stephen Chow's Journey to the West. So be sure to read all of those. Follow me on Twitter and Facebook. Hopefully you like this very, very strange video. If you have not seen my newest Critiquing the Critics episode, I recently released one on Zenith Will Rule. And I shall see you guys later.